So let's start with Keith. Keith Parry is Deputy Head of the Department of Sport and Event Management at Bournemouth University. He's an adjunct fellow of Western Sydney University and a senior fellow of the HEA. His research interests are based on the sociology of sport with a focus on inclusion, health and sports fandom. He's also written for websites such as The Conversation at news.com.au. He's an award-winning teacher and writer. And his PhD examined the formation of sports heroes within the setting of a new professional sports team, the GWS Giants, investigated when and how heroes are formed and who or what dictates their emergence. His research has also examined issues around identity, masculinity, and the conflicts between country and culture. And tonight his paper is titled National Identity, Myth and Sports Heroes. Keith, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. I realised I'd forgot to unmute myself before I shared it and then couldn't find the unmute button once it had disappeared, so apologies about that. Evening, everyone. This presentation is going to draw, as Martin has hinted on, some of my PhD research from Australia. So the context is quite Australian, and I'll try and explain some of that as we go along. But the concepts and principles behind it are applicable across the area. So I'll make a bit of a start. I've been trying to play around with the order and work out what's the best way to present some of these bits before I get into some of the data. And in the end, I've ended up going with what it says on the slide, so national identity. So the concept of nations, as most people will know, is quite young. It peaked around the end of the First World War. And so it's not unlikely that many of the notions that we associate with national identity are going to be rooted in ideals that come from the early 20th centuries, the ideals and the narratives that are there. These narratives have become deeply ingrained in national culture and can be reinforced by heroes in particular. That's one of the key roles of heroes. So if national identity and the concept of nation is constructed, then it's possible for the ideas to be remodeled and to be managed, and for a collective interpretation of national identity to be developed, which is based on all sorts of things. So historical narratives, traditions, common myths, and sport plays a role in this that I'll discuss in a little bit. So nations and the associated concepts such as national identity, importantly to consider, are dual constructs or dual phenomena. They're constructed largely from above, but it's then that they're understood from below, based on the interests and views of the ordinary people, those who aren't necessarily creating them. Now, this is going to be a lot about Australia, and in the Australian sense, given that it's got a complex history, we've got an indigenous population that's been there for millennia, and then we've got an invader-settler society, and there's lots of interesting conflicts that come about as a result of that. Any of you who've been following the cricket over there recently see that there's some underlying issues that carry on as a result of that. But whereas many nations have gone through a period of inventing national identity, according to White, Australia has long supported a whole industry that's devoted to it, to informing Australians of who they are. This sense of Australian identity or Australianness first began to be developed in the 19th century as they were trying to come up with this view of what it meant to be Australian. Although Australian national identity, as with any, is entirely mythical, it could even be classed as fictional, it continues to be a significant concept. And let me just pull up. This is perhaps, when we think about Australian national identity, this is perhaps what you might image, or it's the image that has been created. There is, as I said, an industry that's been has produced these types of images. The view of the bushman, Mick Crocodile Dundee, as you can see on the screen here, is what a lot of people think. And the media industry certainly propagates that. They play on that view. We've got this obviously white-skinned individual who's living a bush life and surviving the harsh realities of what it means to survive, to actually live in the bush and so forth. He's wrestling crocodiles and eating all sorts of food, not just opening tins, for those of you who've seen the film. So yeah, we've got this idea of what it means to be national identity, but actually national identity is linked to all sorts of configurations: ethnic cores, myths, memories, religious beliefs, languages, constructions or connections with territory and political views. So it's complex, and there are all sorts of illusions, distorted images, and delusions, according to Dixon in 1999. So the nations are often reliant on the collective imagination of communities. And obviously, Benedict Anderson's view of his views are kind of clear in this. And Turner points out that most people who now live in an urban modern society, particularly in Australia, often don't meet their fellow citizens. And so the concept of the imagined society and imagined national identity is perhaps even more relevant these days. So if national identity is elusive, then as I said earlier, it can be created, and the media plays a big part in this. But interestingly, Hobsbawm, and this is 92, page 143, claims that's the sportsmen, and he does say men in the quote, that representing their nation, that the primary expressions of these imagined communities. And often that's the only time when we think about what it means to come from a country, is when we're playing sport against someone, when we're seeing our sporting national side. So sports heroes are an important part of national identity. And studies of heroes, there are some out there that largely utilize a social psychological approach. And I've done some of these in the past myself even. And they do identify athletes as heroes. They come up time and time again. There's a load I could list there. But these approaches, and those of sort of social psychologists generally, claim that people are free to make their own choice, that you can choose your own hero. And that often ignores the wider social issues and the wider social constructions that take place. Whereas Orrin Clapp, he contends that personal traits of heroes are unimportant and that it's their socially acceptable deeds that heroes perform that are more significant. And I think, or what I'm going to argue, is that it's not necessarily that individuals are free to choose the hero, but there's many factors at play here. And fans themselves may not have the power to create a hero as it perhaps may be assumed. So I could talk about some of the classical works and heroes, and there's Campbell's work and Carlyle's work. Some of the more modern ones, such as Borstein, who talks about sort of the exploits of great men and what these men do. So in times gone by, it was victories or exploits on the battlefield that were easily understood, or scientific endeavours. In a modern world, we perhaps don't have those, or we hadn't had those until recently. And so often it had been sports people that we turned to. Whereas the achievements of these big men, these great men, were based on unintelligible frontiers, according to Borstein. We can look and see easily what a sports person does. You can understand that someone who runs faster than anyone else has ever run, or can score more goals than anyone has ever scored, may be considered heroic. Whether that should be the case or not is questionable, but that is what we find. And when you ask people, many will be quick to cite a sports hero. They have these people and they'll look up to them. But you'll see the quote on the screen here. This is from Adam Goods, a former Australian footballer and who was also Australian of the Year, so meant to be the best Australian of that particular year. But he challenges people to really try and break down their sports hero and try and understand what it is about them that's important. And that's what not many people do, or not to a great level anyway. So the challenge here is to break down sports heroes and understand why they're important, or heroes more widely. Now, while there is a body of research that covers heroes, and I'll just throw a few up on the screen here, and even some of the people in the room who may cite some of these, I'm not going to go through and say who they are. Hopefully most people recognise the vast majority of these. And there can be reasons cited. So Beckham, it's because of his performance, his lifestyle and so forth. Muhammad Ali, it may be his civil rights stances, etc. You've got Sachin Tendulkar, who embodies the Indian, or embodied the Indian nation, and was venerated almost as a god at times. And then Don Bradman, bottom right, another cricket one in here, who epitomised the Australian struggle against the English or the British, and his exploits in particular. But what we see here is that most of these heroes, all of these heroes, are often examined once they've been formed, once they're already established. And it's very rare that we get to try and look at this process and see what is going on in the middle of it. Now, in 2012, This is where it gets complex for those who don't know anything or much about Australian sport. A new team was formed in the Australian Football League, which is the elite league in Australia, so the top league. And the team was just dropped straight into it. So if you think about sort of the English Premier League, imagine a brand new team who's never played before being thrown straight in the English Premier League and expecting to compete. This team came about in a region where there wasn't really an association with Australian rules. It's more linked with rugby league. But Aussie rules is meant to be one of the national sports. It has some different characteristics from other football codes. It's got all sorts of innovative rules, allegedly. It doesn't have an offside concept. You can see just down to the attire, the shirts are quite different. It is slightly different, but it's uniquely Australian. It's been described or characterised as possessing a free-flowing beauty. It's been described, this is Harms and Jobling, saying a consuming passion of hope and despair, of escape and reality, of religious commitment and frustration. It's an expression of the grand qualities of human endeavour, and it's really important in Australian society. But this establishment of a new team afforded me the unusual opportunity to research the formations of heroes in this rich, complex socio-cultural context, and also to learn about Australian rules when I first went over there. To sum it up, it's a game where you are allowed to have a go at goal from anywhere on the pitch, and you get a point for trying if you miss, it seems, because there's 4 posts, and if you don't get it through the middle ones, you get a point for going through the outside ones. So for someone who likes having a go at goal in football, it was a perfect sport as far as I could see. But this new team were parachuted straight into the top league. As you can see on the screen here, lots of their players were very young. It was a really young roster, lots of young recruits, lots of talented players. And the question may be, how would they fare in their first season? Normally I'd ask people to guess, you can't at this stage, but they finished bottom. They were ranked last. They won only 2 games in their first year, and so didn't do particularly well. Their second season, they actually did worse. They only won 1 game, and they again finished last. In the third season, they brought in some new, more experienced players, and they had a slightly better season. They had 6 wins and finished in 16th place, so 16 out of 18 teams. And by their 4th year, they reached 11th place and won half of their regular season games. Now they are regularly competing at the top of the league, or the top of the ladder. But at the time when I was collecting data on this, they were not doing well. Going to watch games was not much fun. They basically got thrashed every game, and it wasn't particularly competitive. So in this environment where you've got a team of young, unknown players who are literally getting thrashed every week, how do you come up with a hero? How do heroes emerge from this? Watching the games, there wasn't much, so I started to look at media coverage and fan forums and watch what fans were saying and what the media were saying, and also the club communication, so a form of sort of ethnographic or online content analysis, and sort of engaging with these communities was used. I won't go into sort of the specifics, but lots of forums, lots of time spent seeing what fans were saying, and also pouring through the media coverage. And there were 3 figures that came up who I've previously described as the good, the bad, and the ugly. This doesn't sound overly complimentary. The ugly is obviously not a specific reference to physical features, it's just the behaviour. I'll explain about these 3 quickly now. So on the left, we've got Israel Folau, who may be famous to people for his religious views. In the middle, Kevin Sheedy, the coach of the club. And on the right, Jeremy Cameron. Cameron was an unknown player who'd come from humble backgrounds and rose up through the ranks. Folau was a convert from rugby league, and he's now on to his 3rd or perhaps 4th sport. He seems to sell himself to the highest bidder at times. Sheedy, as the coach of the fledgling club, assumed sort of a father figure. He was wise, he was more experienced and learned than all the others. But Jeremy Cameron was an interesting one. He was presented in ways that extenuated his body, his physique, his whiteness, his athleticism. The playing kit, as you can see, often allows that to be sort of made apparent, the way that you can see the muscles and the bodies of the player. He fits the traditional Anglo-Celtic image of Australian footballers and reinforces dominant attributes of Aussie national identity. In Australia, as in many societies, heroes are dominated by whiteness to an extent, and Australian football in particular has been the sport of the White Australia policy, which tried to reinforce and, to an extent, keep Australia for white migrants and not from people from other countries. That was enshrined within their actual national policy at times. Sheedy's heroisation was based on his history in the game. He was the first player to be involved, or coach to be involved in 1,000 games. He was tied to notions of working class ideals, the military, lots of historical notions of what it meant to be Australian, particularly in a working class region. So he was heroised also because he stood up against the more elite and better, more successful clubs. He used and played perhaps on some Irish ancestry here, but he played. He was very much using his brain rather than brawn to try and outwit them and to be sort of more witty than they were at times. Israel Folau, on the other hand, came into the sport with no background. He'd never played it before. He'd not even watched it on television before, and he was a total flop. He was getting millions of dollars a year. He lasted one season and then quit to play in another code. So from these three heroes, there was a couple of sort of key notions that came about. And national identity was perhaps the biggest thing that came through. So, as I've said, there were typical views on what it means to be a typical Australian. These are generally the Anglo-Celtic mate. And you saw that coming through a lot in Sheedy and in Folau. And where they fit this ideal, they were more readily accepted. Folau, yes, he wasn't a great player, but clearly doesn't fit with this image. He's of Polynesian heritage. Although he was from the region, he travelled around and moved around, and he just didn't fit within the sport. So the heroic figures throughout Australian history have generally reflected masculine ideals, and this is what we saw with Cameron. That very much came through in his case. He was also portrayed as being the boy from the bush, and this is a stereotypical but not, I guess, untypical Australian image, where you've got the countryside being this mythical place, the source of everything that's good in Australia. And we hear time and time again, from Bradman to Cameron, Philip Hughes when he died, the cricketer, you saw it there, you hear it all the time, this notion of the boy from the bush, this immaculate talent that comes through in stories. Comes through in stories and says that it's just a natural way that sporting talent comes from, that you can almost just whistle up the country and you get these cricketers who come and appear or whatever it is. So it's also linked to this hero myth, one of the original hero myths. So Campbell's particular monomyth, where you get this unknown, unpromising talent who suddenly appears on the scene, defeats all the foes around them, and then at the end of it retires back to humble beginnings, or dies or does something and goes home in that sense. And the Australian notion of the boy from the bush really encapsulates this. Is also, I guess, the Cinderella hero, the unpromising hero. It's been termed in many societies in that sense. Sheedy, on the other hand, was slightly different. He was the larrikin Australian. And this is one that doesn't necessarily just capture an Australian narrative, but it's the trickster, the cunning hero, the clever hero that we see in images like on the screen here, Robin Hood. It's, again, brains over brawn. And this hero type you'll see again through many societies. So where we've got society exerting this influence over individuals and over heroes, what I found through my research is that we start to see the views on heroization, on sport as such, being shaped by wider society. So yes, people have their own individual views on it, but these notions, these images, these myths of what it means to be a person from that particular country shape the views. And the collective beliefs, I don't know what that is, but collective beliefs and the familiar patterns in each society just become embedded within the consciousness or the unconsciousness of that particular culture. So heroes facilitate cultural identification for large numbers of the population, but they emphasize the traditional values and norms of the dominant cultural core, the dominant cultural classes. And in essence, they act as agents of social control. So they encourage people to emulate these virtues that they represent, that they epitomize. And so they reinforce old, stereotypical, traditional views of national identity. Modern sporting heroes are no different, as I've shown, that they tend to reinforce these ideals over and over. So although there's been arguments that hero types are not consistent across countries or across periods, actually when you start to look at what it is about them and the underlying myths and narratives, they're very heavily influenced by social cultural context. But you can trace a lot of these back to earlier times and through mythology. So mindful of the time, I think I'm probably winding down. So the myths that are deeply ingrained in Western society are depicted often as an everlasting pattern, according to Levi Strauss, that's claimed that once they become established, can be very resistant to revision. And this is the type of thing I found here, that often there was factual information, we see this in all sorts of heroes, down to people like Dodd and Bradman, where it's just ignored. Items that don't fit within the narrative or don't fit to what everyone knows about the hero are ignored, and just people pretend it didn't happen. So there is an ingrained hero shape that to be successful, it seems these heroes have to fit. And as I've said, where that is not necessarily the case, these bits can either be ignored or sort of whitewashed over or just done away with. Where there is a major issue or incongruence between the actual facts and the hero shape, then the hero may not be successful. That they may not fit to it. And that was the case certainly with Israel Folau, because one, his face didn't fit, and two, he perhaps wasn't good enough in that sense. And so, the hero has to fit that shape and the myths and traditions associated with national identity. So if they don't fit that, they will not necessarily work. So sports heroes and indeed wider heroes need to be considered in relation to the broader mythological narratives and representations of the dominant modes of national identity. This is what seems to be important. This is what really threads through all of these cases. The ones that are successful uphold dominant narratives in the construction of national identity. So heroization doesn't just reinforce that, but because it's historically rooted, we can see that heroes are positioned in the broader sense of the wider. Sorry, my computer just played up there. In the wider pattern of universal narratives of global myths and ideologies. So the myths are not necessarily fixed or immutable, and there was some fluidity in this. Sheedy moved between groups. He became a trickster or shifted depending on the situation. So there is possibility of moving between them, but the narratives themselves seem to be fairly fixed. We know these types, we recognize them, they're comfortable to us. But to sum up, heroization then is not reliant on the deeds or physical characteristics. It is in fact the narratives that are built up around them. But these narratives are deeply embedded in society, and the hero script will be consistent across many different societies or contexts. They're often they're to an extent then universal narratives that are reproduced at various national levels and tweaked maybe. So you get a slight difference between Australia and the UK and in other countries, but they're ones that we do recognize. So there may be a limited number of hero types depending on the culture, and that perhaps we need to see which ones are most culturally relevant, and when a society changes, it may take time for these to change. It'll be interesting to watch and see how that does change. That's I'll probably finish there. I've got some other stuff I could waffle on about, but I'm mindful of the time, so I'll probably stop there if that's about right.
Thanks, Keith. That is absolutely perfect timing, spot on 20 minutes. We have time for one or two questions. Nobody's asked to ask a question in the chat, so I'm gonna launch in with one actually, and then if there'll be time for somebody else. So Keith, I don't know how familiar you are with English football, but I was thinking about Marcus Rashford a lot as you were talking, and I was wondering what you make of the sort of the media treatment, but also some of the sort of the public response to him. So just for those of you who aren't familiar with English football, Marcus Rashford is a young black player, plays for Manchester United. He comes from Manchester, but he's become most noticeable in recent months because of his campaign against child poverty and the pressure he's applied to the British government to provide free school meals for children in poverty in the UK. So, my question basically, Keith, was where does Marcus Rashford sit in your framework, really?
Yeah, I mean, you can look at it from a sort of a pro-social behaviour to that sort of basic, the social psychological view. And yeah, he's doing lots of good things that we reinforce throughout society. I wonder to what extent, I think there's two aspects to it. You see a lot of times, and this was really the case in Australia, but you see it here as well, that players that aren't from the dominant cultural core, that we accept it to a certain extent, so long as they don't create and cause too many problems. And he has seen a backlash from certain areas, and there has been that vilification of him for speaking out and challenging areas. I think because he's challenging poverty, there's perhaps a more accepted narrative there because he's black and he's only campaigning against poverty. He's not specifically saying this is about race. It's a broader brush that he's using. So I wonder how much he will be challenged on that. But even still, I think that it is going to be a large stretch for Rashford to be fully accepted and fully heroised by everyone within society, because we've seen with the Black Lives Matter protests that our society is still venerating these very traditional Anglo ideals, these visions of whiteness, the statues that we've got, the institutions, the language we use. It's all coming from a stance of whiteness, and it's going to be very hard to break that down, I think. So he will be accepted to an extent, but again, maybe the way that he's accepted or not by government figures and official figures, we might see some of that coming through, that there's an extent to which he will be successful or will be accepted there. On the sporting pitch, it's okay. That's where we allow allow the other as such in that sense to have a voice or to show what they can do. But it's when they try and cross over into other areas that issues perhaps rise. So it'll be interesting to see, I guess, is a short answer. I don't know.
No, I think that was a great and very full answer, actually. So thank you. Vitali has a question. So I'm going to hand over to him. And then after Vitali's question, we'll move on to our second speaker, John. So Vitali, would you like to unmute yourself and put your video on if you're happy to do so?
Apologies, I didn't have a question. I was just clapping to Keith to thank him for the very interesting presentation.
Okay.
I'll take the round of applause. Thank you very much.
Okay. Anyone got a question? No. Okay. In that case, we'll move on to so John. So a virtual round of applause for Keith and for his fantastic paper, and also I think for being the first person to have spoken about Australian sport, I think, since we started. Thanks. Okay, so we'll move on to our final speaker tonight, who is Janko Likaku. Janko is an analytically creative researcher with a keen focus on sports and governance. In his research at the University of Pretoria, Janko explored the relationship between sports and governance, and by using the 2010 FIFA World Cup, he explored in particular the relationship between the state and a supranational organisation, FIFA, in order to shed light on a pattern that seems to have become prevalent in the post-millennial world, and explore how the shifting global politics at the end of the Cold War has affected how domination manifests in relations between states and capitalist corporations. Of importance in Janko's research was the impact of the relationship and the tournament on South Africa before, during and after hosting. And his paper tonight is called Playing Ball, the Relationship Between the State and FIFA in South Africa 2010. Janko, over to you.
Thank you, Martin. First of all, before I even get into anything, I'd just like to thank you and from the University of Bristol for the opportunity to present in this conference. It's really a great thing for me. I don't have a presentation, so I'm going to talk quite a bit. Keith spoke about waffling. I probably will do that quite a bit because I don't have a presentation. However, I'm going to mostly speak about the latter part of my paper, just a chunk of it from my master's dissertation. We're going to look mostly on the impacts on South Africa and how what I speak about in the beginning parts, which is the domination and the prevalent power dynamics and the power distributions globally manifest themselves in South Africa through FIFA during the World Cup. Especially because, to a large extent, a World Cup in Africa was unheard of. It was going to happen until Blatter said he wanted it to happen. So it happening in Africa was one of those things where, for Africa, not only for Africa alone, but in the world, it was one of those big moments where, even when those shootings up north in Africa, and they wanted to take the World Cup away. I remember Arsene Wenger had spoken about how to let Africans deal with African problems and to trust them with the tournament going forward, regardless of what's happening in Africa. So a World Cup in Africa, I think, to a large extent, had not only shaken the interest of basically the world, but I think also specifically in South Africa, because history of sports in South Africa is absolutely racially based. This is because, to a large extent, football in South Africa is seen as a black sport, whereas cricket, rugby, swimming are more white sports, or so much so that even in the sports themselves, cricket and football, cricket and rugby have quotas for black athletes, whereas football, on the other hand, does not have that. The participation it's growing, but it's not as largely as when you're trying to enforce it in rugby or cricket itself. Therefore, having a football World Cup in South Africa was pretty interesting for the South African demographic and the South African conversation alone. Former President late Nelson Mandela had mentioned that having a World Cup in South Africa was not only a dream for him, but would have been an achievement for, and he put it like this, our people. I think our people in that sense can be twofold. The first could be our people, South Africa in general, the Rainbow Nation, every single person who lives in South Africa, who says they're South African. It was an achievement for every single person, but also our people in that, the black people, because it's typically a black sport. Him saying something like this for the World Cup not only underscores what the prevalent idea of what's happening in South Africa is, but also shows that there's a growing black elite in South Africa who engaged in most of the conversations regarding the World Cup. So beyond the power distribution that exists between global North transnational corporations or multinational corporations or international organizations, but there's an extension of this to the elites in the developing countries that they interact with. And this, to a large extent, in South Africa has become black elites. So it's not necessarily that continued prevalent idea of it's whites versus blacks, but you've got black people in elite positions not caring too much on the what happens in South Africa regarding the majority of the people. And this is something that I noted in my dissertation at the end when I speak about it, that the World Cup in South Africa, we see that not only was it about getting FIFA what FIFA wants through FIFA's demands that Loretta Lynch had kind of figured out through bribery and vote rigging and stuff like that, which I don't necessarily get into. But FIFA guarantees itself that it gets its financial returns from the World Cup. But what I look at specifically is that the local elites benefit, but there's no trickle down. And that's the dangerous part, is that there was no trickle down. And therefore, you start to think, why did South Africa want the World Cup? And those are the questions that I was asking. And those are the questions that triggered my thought process in trying to write my dissertation for my master's. I was thinking at why did South Africa go the extra mile to get a World Cup? Because what triggered my thought process was the fact that FIFA was getting investigated by Loretta Lynch, and we know, and there was evidence coming out that South Africa had paid Jack Warner to actually win the World Cup, and this went on further with in so many other expositions that I had read during my dissertation that exposed FIFA for vote rigging and how FIFA go about making decisions, and basically the corporate institution that is FIFA at the time, especially during Blatter. And then I kind of started figuring out why would South Africa really want a World Cup? And the intriguing part of this is that South Africa, to a large extent, has used sports as a national building tool. This was prevalent firstly in 1996, right after apartheid, when the Rugby World Cup, which South Africa happens to win, was used and to bring people together. It worked out in the benefit of South Africa at the time. This also was followed further in 1996 when South Africa hosted the AFCON, which is the African Confederation Football Tournament. And then again in 1999 on the All Africa Games. South Africa has noticed a trend that when it comes to sports, it brings people together. Even studies post the World Cup show that what the World Cup in South Africa in 2010 did was bring people together. There was a sense of safety. By bringing a sense of safety through half the things South Africa had to do, which I'll get into in a little bit now, to get the World Cup, that they created a sense of safety and uniformity where people could come together. The unfortunate thing with this is that South Africa, especially the public sector, has not been great at delivering on big things. So delivering on a World Cup created an expectation among South Africans that there will be a continued deliverance of such great service, with lack of a better word, in terms of how South Africa will go about getting things done after the World Cup. Unfortunately, this did not happen, which makes you keep on considering what is the impact of a World Cup in a developing state? What does FIFA gain from a World Cup in a developing state? The first point I'm going to make is that, to a large extent, watching how FIFA behave with South Africa specifically, you see how there's a sense of domination, and I believe that this is the case on many World Cups regarding demands. I think what makes the demands dangerous for a developing state, in this case South Africa, is some of these demands come at the expense of locals. Some of these demands come at the expense of the promises that the local organization committee, who are said to represent the people, come at, because they actually do not represent their people to a large extent, because they speak from an elite basis again, and the trickle down does not happen. So that's the first point I'm trying to make, is that the domination ends up happening because when FIFA speaks to elites who are assumed to speak on behalf of the people, their decisions that the local organization committee gets into with FIFA that guarantee FIFA what FIFA needs. So things like visas and exports and imports regarding foreign currency and things of the sort. It leaves no money behind in South Africa for development. It left no money behind, not as much money in South Africa regarding further development outside of the World Cup. Also, South Africa itself had put in a lot of money for the World Cup. I think it was close to 5 billion into the World Cup, not only in developing stadiums, but also in developing transport and security, and to ensure that there was adequate accommodation and things of the sort. Things that had lost them the World Cup previously in 2006, when they had bid to be the first time. So South Africa went into a process where they tried to rectify all the things that rendered them almost not eligible to win a World Cup in 2006, in 2010, in such a way that, because in 2010 they were running against a lot of African countries, South Africa, to a large extent, as much as its football may not be at the top of the world, or top of the list in Africa, but to a large extent in terms of development, they are pretty far ahead. So because of this, it put South Africa in a place where it really didn't have as much competition other than Morocco in terms of hosting a World Cup. However, regardless of this, South Africa, to a large extent, had to put in the necessary mechanisms to be able to host the World Cup. So some of the things that happen with the demands FIFA make is they affect the locals adversely. One of the things I'd like to speak about is when South Africa started to entrench in law some of the demands they were making with FIFA. I think one of the major laws that did this was in 2006, two bids, Act 11 and Act 12 of the Special Measures Act. What they did is entrenched all the FIFA demands into South African law. Basically, the law had to ensure that what FIFA had demanded on South Africa had to happen. There was no way that South Africa could go beyond, could go against it, because now they've set the ball rolling to ensure that they can host the World Cup. This resulted not only in FIFA and its commercial partners being guaranteed certain things in South Africa, but there were also other South African partners who partnered with FIFA that also had to be guaranteed. Their revenue and their benefits from the World Cup. What this did is, in terms of advertising, there could be no other advertising besides the companies that FIFA had partnerships with in South Africa. What this did is that other local companies that were promised in the build up to the World Cup an opportunity to showcase themselves were not able to do this, because regarding FIFA's agreements, it had to be the partners and things of the sort. Not only that, FIFA then asked for South Africa to have special courts. These were called the FIFA Courts. The FIFA Courts then were set up in 56 different locations. The thing about FIFA Courts in South Africa is the judicial system in South Africa is relatively slow. And because it's relatively slow, the rapid nature of how the FIFA Courts went through giving decisions, about 90 minutes or so, as was written in many articles and things of the sort, was unheard of in South Africa. What this did is it cost South African government, I think, close to $500,000 or something like that, even more, to ensure that, I think it was about 600 million, to ensure that these courts are running efficiently. However, after the World Cup, these courts did not continue at this system. There was no exchange of knowledge or a trickle down in terms of how the courts in South Africa continue to behave. And this is what, to a large extent, disgruntled many local South Africans, because the World Cup in South Africa seems to be a momentary blip in terms of what South Africa can actually do and actually achieve, but it did not continue beyond that. Furthermore, South Africa has a lot of street vendors. It's best practice in Africa for some of you who visited South Africa and most of the African countries, where there's a lot of vendors around across the streets. This is prevalent during football games. The World Cup presented an opportunity for a lot of street vendors who are in the informal sector to a large extent to make not only money, but to also be able to showcase their talents and showcase their products. However, because of the agreements that South Africa makes with FIFA, these people could not engage in business with anyone close to any stadium or any area that was demarcated a FIFA special zone. So in the result of this is that many of these local people were actually affected by it, because during that period, the people they assumed they were going to be able to make business off of didn't actually come through. They weren't able to interact with or make as much money as they anticipated. Furthermore, to a large extent, how FIFA went about distributing tickets and accommodation packages, things of the sort, was through a company called Match AG. Match AG was given tickets to a large extent, and they went ahead and booked accommodations, and they booked safaris and things of the sort on the premise that they were going to sell packages to visitors or tourists and things of the sort. When the World Cup actually happened, not many people turned up South Africa, and these packages had to be sold back to the respective hotels. However, what happened was that when these packages were being negotiated, there was the pressure of having them negotiated at a lower price. Because of this, most of the resorts and most of the accommodation places did not end up making close to as much as they had anticipated they would make during this period. And this again affected not only the industry but also how South Africans perceived the payback from a World Cup. Because when the World Cup was being bid for, there was an idea that there'll be a growth in jobs, a growth in job opportunities, a growth in interaction of small businesses within South Africa. What ended up happening is that this was not materialized. What the government had initially stated to people they would make from the World Cup did not actually come out as it stated. What happened is that a lot of the money that was spent, not only did not come back, but it created long-term issues for local South Africans in certain areas. And not only that, but extended the inequality gap. For one, with transport, South Africa had to ensure that transport was at the top, was at the best, and that everyone could get from the airport to where they needed to be quickly. This resulted in South Africa investing in what is known as the How train. The How train, unfortunately, is not for the people that actually struggle with transport. The How train caters for a middle class and upper class within South Africa, because the fees for a How train or a How train bus are not readily accessible to a local South African. So the impact of the World Cup with the How train has not necessarily benefited the locals, even though it has improved to a large extent the accessibility of transport for the middle and upper class. Not only that, in extending the inequality gap, a lot of the contracts that FIFA got into in terms of some of the things that needed to happen during the World Cup, prior to, during, and to a less extent after, went to elites who are called in South Africa tenderpreneurs, who won these tenders, and to a large extent only did not allow for a trickle down. Mostly because to a large extent FIFA is fine with dealing with a company that it's got a history with, so it would bring its own partners to do some of this work. Therefore, to a large extent, many of the informal workers with construction and things of the sort, they struggled to get the jobs that they anticipated they would get in construction. Furthermore, regarding construction, some World Cup stadiums were built, like the stadium in Durban, Moses Mabhida, and there's a stadium in Nelspruit, Mbombela Stadium, and a stadium in Cape Town. These stadia after the World Cup have not been largely used, because these stadia were built close to or in an area where there was a previous stadium. However, some of these stadiums that existed already in the country existed in spaces that are not affluent. Therefore, instead of choosing to upgrade those stadiums, they decided to spend more money to build new stadiums. However, these stadiums not only are too big, but don't have the capacity to hold every single person, especially for specific games. So because of this, to a large extent, the impact of not upgrading an already standing stadium affects the locals, because the money that could have been put into upgrading a stadium went into building a whole new stadium. And this is the prevailing thought among South Africans when it comes to a World Cup. There are these symbols of how efficient the government and the public sector can be in delivering, but there is no trickle down and continued effort in doing this, and therefore there's a negative sense that comes to interaction of FIFA and the impact of a FIFA World Cup in South Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Janko. That absolutely perfect timing. Bang on 20 minutes. Are there any questions? Nothing's popped up in the chat, but just jump in if you have a question. I'll kick off while people have a think. This might be an unfair question, but I wondered if you'd noticed similar kind of responses to the Olympics, and particularly the idea of legacy, which is built into the contract that is established with the IOC. Have you sort of noticed is this something that seems to be part and parcel now of hosting the mega sporting event, the idea of the legacy, the inevitable failure of such legacies, the lack of policing of legacy, if you like, to see that it is actually that governments deliver on it?
I think to a large extent, yes. In the whole paper, I touch on how FIFA and the IOC have similarities. And not just that, I also touch on low-key almost throwing forward to the impact of the World Cup in Brazil and the Olympics in Brazil as well. I think what's unfortunate to a large extent in the developing world is these promises are made. And because the promises are made, it's not necessarily, to a large extent, I don't think the problem falls on the IOC and FIFA to a large extent. It's the promise makers.
Yeah.
The people making the promises are leveraging revenue over the betterment of society. So I think the question goes back to, is it worth it? Is it necessary? Is it time to actually have World Cups cost that much in a developing state for the, like you've mentioned now, the legacy, as opposed to putting that revenue that could have come in a World Cup to fixing what needs to be fixed first before this thing happens. Don't get me wrong. I am not in any way shooting down having a World Cup in a developing state. I think not only is it a good idea to a large extent, but I think it's also ideal that it brings a sense of, with lack of a better word, pride to a developing world country to be able to host a World Cup, to be able to successfully host a World Cup in a space where there's, to a large extent, maybe not so much as before, there's almost a shunning eye based on developing states, specifically in Africa. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yes, thank you. Are there any other questions? No, if not, then I'm going to draw things to a close here. I'd like to, for us all, to thank our three speakers, again, Keith, John and Yanko. This has been an absolutely fascinating panel. I should have said at the beginning that the theme was creating sporting legacies. The three papers have really cohered very nicely around that, looking at different phases in the process of creation and identification. And so big virtual round of applause to our three speakers. Thanks to everybody who's turned up tonight and joined us again for another global event. This for me has been one of the few positives of COVID, is that we've been able to put these events on. We've been able to, although John hasn't been able to come here and appreciate the Bristol rain that we've had today. It's great to see all you virtually, and I look forward to the day when maybe we all get to meet up in person and we can finish a research seminar down the pub. But I'm going to leave you to it now. I have posted in the chat details of the next workshop, which is on the 8th of February, but I'll send an email invitation to you all. So thanks, enjoy the rest of your evening or whatever time of day it is, wherever you are. Thank you.